being here. I appreciate the fact that you've been patient because when the legislature got over, normally we have it, but I didn't see many of you around here at 1:30 in the morning last Saturday morning. Well, I wasn't looking for you. That's why I didn't see you. I received the committees from both the House and the Senate. They're advising me that they had adjourned sine die. I didn't see any of you guys following them like you normally do. So I didn't know if you were here or not. But anyway, I want to open it up this morning with a few general comments, and then I'm going to ask both the Senate and the House to speak to it, their feelings about the session, and then we'll open it up for questions. And so let's wait till then. And I was just explaining to folks that I kind of look at this session, and I know I'm going to be asked to put a grade on it. And I'm going to have to revert back to my high school days when I got a grade per subject. And I would say, because I used to get like an A in history, but an F in English, or something like that. But anyway, so breaking it down, I would say education got an absolute A, excellent. In fact, if there's a higher grade than that, I would give it. I think we started the session understanding that we needed to keep past promises. We worked hard to make sure that we got that, and it was reflected for the most part in the votes in both the House and the Senate that put us on a course to satisfy the task force recommendations. And the task force recommendations were the result of a lot of hard work by all the stakeholders. And so I would give the education portion of the grade an A. There's a lot of incompletes. There's probably, I would say maybe a B minus, C plus on transportation, but it wouldn't be hard to give that an incomplete. But it's a good start. And I was appreciative of the fact that, especially on transportation, we didn't have the debate that we engaged in 08 and 09 when we were working on transportation around whether or not we needed the money. The question was, yes, we do need more money, but the question is always, where are you going to get it? And I think the legislature finished up the work on transportation for this year as a beginning toward the eventual needs and fulfilling those eventual needs. There's a lot of other issues that I could go into, but let me just say in general about the legislature that I don't recall, and I think maybe many of you have heard me say this before, I don't recall a legislative session that was so preoccupied with multiple year solutions. Even in the transportation bill, there was a lot of effort to get a multiple year solution out there, and there's a flavor of that in the bill that we ended up with. But on education, you know, check the record, find out when we've ever had a 5-year plan and a 5-year solution on education that we bought into, we voted for, we signed, and we signed on to it, and so we went forward. But there were a lot of it. Mental health is probably a good example of a multiple year solution. Because when we discussed where the next mental health crisis center was going to be, we also said we expect to have one in all of the districts eventually. This one is going to go north of the Salmon River in the different time zone. I suspect that, I don't know where it's going to go. That's going to be up to Dick Armstrong and those folks that worked on it the last time. And so, anyway, let me end there because I'd like to provide plenty of time for questions, and we do want to get this down within 45 minutes. So I'm going to ask the Speaker of the House to reflect on the session. Scott.
Thank you, Governor. As I reflect on this session, I have to say that it was a monumental session from my perspective. Keep in mind, we have 40 some odd pretty new legislators, pretty new House members. And what was gratifying to me was to see them engage on these big issues. And whether it was, we had new vice chairs for these committees, particularly in education. I thought that Chairman DeMordaunt and Representative Van Orden, as well as their counterparts in the Senate, did an excellent job. There were some dark hours as we were working towards the final solution that passed nearly unanimously out of both bodies. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, and so you had a lot of new legislators that were put into and forced to negotiate on issues, and they had to listen to other voices than their own, and they came up with something that I think we can be completely proud of as a state. The same thing happened with regard to the transportation thing. In the House, we had a lot of new ideas. One legislator said it was just like popcorn going off. We had all of these different ways to approach the transportation issue. So that was healthy. Of course, we couldn't come to couldn't come to agreement, and so we had the conference committee. And I was proud of those members that stuck to it, and like the governor said, we have a start there. One other thing that I think goes largely unnoticed, there was in the transportation area, there was this desire on many House members' part to go to the general fund. And the economy is recovering, there's growth in the economy, and there was this desire to use some of that growth to go to the roads. And I think we've done that in a responsible way, but at the same time, our Joint Finance and Appropriation Committee has done a great job. Whenever you have 4.6% growth year over year, and half of the budget takes up 7.4, half of the budget is allowed to grow at 7.4, then the other half has to grow at 1.8 in order to blend them together to get 4.6. And that's not easy, having been on the appropriation committee. That's not an easy job to do. And I think our committee stepped up, and they reflect the conservative values of their constituents. And so not only did we address education in a way that is sustainable, in a way that we can all be proud of, but at the same time, they kept the lid on the other half of the budget so that, our priority of K-12 funding could be funded. I look forward to your questions on these and other subjects, and I'll defer.
Okay. Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My pleasure to just visit with you a little bit about my impressions of this session. I think some will call it historic because we were able to make some big strides in education funding. And I think back to 2009 when I first came in the legislature. The economy was crashing around us, our revenues were falling, and there were lots of things that had to be done. If it weren't for rainy day funds, we would have had to make bigger cuts than we did. But I can remember sitting on the Education Committee for 4 years while we're going through all these very tough issues, and I think a very public promise was made, and that was when the money was available, we would get it back into the teachers' pockets and into education. And I think that's what this legislature did, and I think we can all be very proud of that. On this aspect of transportation, did we get to where we really need to be in funding? No, I don't think we did, but I think this is a huge step forward. And I think back to 1996 when we originally put in the 4 cent plus 1 cent, how difficult that was. And yet this time we were able to get some registration fee increases and a 7 cent increase. I've had a few people that have jumped me about it, but most people have been very supportive of saying, yes, you can't do deficit spending in infrastructure, you need to spend more money. There's one area that I think we all want to work on in the upcoming session, and I think there'll be a working group working on this over this summer session, and it deals with what type of tax relief and priorities the legislature will set during the next session. I think the Senate really objected to trying to deal with some of the kind of quick tax adjustments and policy decisions that were being requested at the end of the session. But we're also very supportive of the effort of trying to prioritize how we move forward and how we look for tax relief in the future. I think that's a very important part of what came out of this session, and I think it will be huge for the future. I think business, one of the interesting things was the benefits corporation that was brought forward. I think that will help a lot of our young corporations out there that have not only a profit conscience but a social conscience and working benefits in their communities and throughout the state. I saw a lot of cooperation throughout the various agencies, Department of Commerce, working with INL, all the different things that were going on out there to make this a more economic, viable state and to grow our economy. So I was really pleased with the session. It was a hard session, just because there were lots of issues going on that were personal challenges, I think, to all of us as we dealt with some of these issues. But all in all, I would say, as I would agree with the governor on his rating, there were areas that were certainly in the A level, and there were areas that we didn't quite meet the expectations, and we'll keep working on those. But thank you for being here, and thanks for the opportunity to address you. Thanks.
Thank you.
But our grade point average still allows us to go out for football.
And other physical sports.
That's right.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions. Yes, listen.
Governor, have you decided yet how you're going to deal with Senate Bill 1067, the child support? And are you going to call a special session?
Let me ask Dick to come up. Dick, work your way around those cameras. Let me ask Director Armstrong if he can kind of give you the background. And I think it's important that we understand the consequences of doing nothing. And then I'll follow up that with what we're working on. Go ahead.
Thank you, Governor. We have received notice of the intent of Children and Family Services to disapprove our state plan. And what that means is we have 60 days in order to cure the situation, meaning that we will be then in compliance with all of the provisions that are set forth. Our challenge is that we really do need to be clearly engaged in the interstate compact that we've been part of for decades. Since 1996, when healthcare reform or welfare reform took place, Idaho has been an active member of that treaty with the other states. We depend on reciprocity with other states in order to move court orders for support from one state to Idaho, and for us to reciprocate and move money from Idaho to other states. We have built all of our operating systems around those tools that have been made available. We're very efficient. We have always sought to have a highly effective and efficient system to work with other states. Unfortunately, the loss of this approval means then that not only do we lose the federal dollars that we have depended on forever, about 2/3 of our operating budget comes from federal support, but more importantly is we do not have access to the tools that allow us to be able to, for example, withhold wages from an employer in another state, for us to be able to use location tools, for us to be able to identify where the non-custodial parent might be in the United States. So we're greatly concerned of the unintended consequences of this action, and certainly look to the governor and the legislature to help us find an answer, find a cure, so we can then go back to doing the business of supporting families in Idaho.
You might mention the letter that you're going to have to send.
Yes, we have an obligation to all of our customers to notify them of any significant change in operations that would impact their daily lives or the benefits they receive. And so we are preparing a letter which we will send to all of the households in Idaho that are currently receiving support dollars from our agency. It's the right thing to do, because these folks will have to make some significant adjustments in their daily budgets and their daily lives if we are unable to transfer this money to their households.
Any other questions on the impact bill?
Governor, so you've had 60 days of window to correct this somehow. Is there any solution other than a special session, calling the legislators back in to revote this? Is there an administrative solution? If there's not, do you have a timetable in mind for when you might announce a decision on a session?
Well, the timetable that we have in mind is relative to the letter that we received. And that is, we were trying to figure out, we're 60 days from when we received the letter or when the letter was sent. So it's either June 12th or June 14th that we're going to have a solution. Otherwise, we're going to suffer the unintended consequences that Director Armstrong just outlined.
And so how are you going to find that solution?
Well, we had a meeting with the pro tem and the speaker this morning and to work out a path forward. I'm not prepared to go into the nuts and bolts of that path forward. But I think it's important over the next few days, as quickly as possible, and as Director Armstrong gets the letter out to, what would that be? How many people?
155,000 households.
155,000, which is more people than the 155,000 households. But getting that letter out so that folks recognize, I think, is going to get back and engage folks in saying, okay, where are we going to go? And putting the kind of emphasis on the failure of 1067 that we have already started to receive input from.
But Governor, you're the only one who can call a special session of the legislature, and if that's the only way to fix this, are you going to do it?
Well, I think there's an anticipation, or I would expect, that I'm not prepared to stand up here today and tell you I'm going to call a special session. Because I think there's a lot of homework for us to do in order, if we were to have a special session, to have a successful one. One that folks are informed, one that they understand all the nuances, that they understand the pros and cons, and engaging the legislative leadership, the legislative committees, health and welfare, on the issue, so that as we do go forward, we're not, it's not another issue that we short stroke. That was one of the complaints that we have, but I would remind you that the bill was introduced in the early part of February, in fact, I think February 12th. It actually came out of committee on March 11th in the Senate. It was passed 34-01 in the Senate on March 20th. And so advanced to the House. And so I would hardly call that a late night effort for us to, quote unquote, pull the wool over somebody's eyes. So I don't want to be accused of that again. So it's going to be a very deliberative and engaging process with all the stakeholders.
Is there any idea if there are any other options besides calling a special session? Is there anything else we can do to come into compliance?
Now, this is law. This is law. This is not something you can do with an executive order. And so it has to go into our statute, and it has to be verbatim. As it was sent, there's an ability, and other states have already exercised their ability. And we've reviewed Utah and Wyoming's, what they have put in their code. And that has satisfied, in fact, DC has told us that if we were to go that direction and put it in a different title, at a different part of the code, that that would be acceptable in order to overcome some of the apprehension that certain members had about us adopting the absolute. This is a uniform law, so it's got to be uniform in its verbiage.
Governor Otter, are you willing to do nothing on this and see if the federal government will carry out the plan?
That's not even entered the discussion. We are going to be engaged, and we're going to do something.
Governor, do you have a comment on those 9 committee members who voted at the table with this bill, keeping it in committee, in terms of their motivation or their understanding of this issue?
Well, I've reviewed all the questions that and the substance that those folks sent from the House committee to the Attorney General. I've reviewed the Attorney General's answers. I haven't talked to the Attorney General about it specifically, but I intend to. And so I'm going to decline to speak to the 9 folks that voted to table that bill.
Governor, you brought up Utah a second ago. If we use Utah as a benchmark, they're dealing with a lot of the same issues as we are.
They're what?
They're dealing with a lot of the same issues as we are: transportation, tax cuts, education, Medicaid redesign. Like, if we use them as our benchmark rather than just giving a random letter grade, how do you judge us in comparison to them?
Well, you've been following Utah a lot closer than I have, because I talk to Gary Herbert, Governor Herbert, quite often, but we don't generally run down a list of those. We're working on Sagecrest. We got a lot of other things that we're working on, and I do know that he felt like he was having a very successful legislative session the last time that I talked to him. But I said I was too, because we had just passed the education bill.
Governor, your veto on Senate Bill 1011 has been called into question as to whether the correct procedure was followed. Coeur d'Alene Tribe has said that they will be looking into possible litigation on the matter. Do you think that that veto will hold up in court?
Yes.
Are you concerned that several senators also challenged the motion, and that there could be some severe implications for the racing industry here in?
Well, those are all things that are probably going to have to be decided by the court, but the fact that they sustained my veto, there are other utterances, or there are other letters that they read in a different order of business notwithstanding, they still failed to override my veto. Next question.
Yeah, Governor, this year you denied a request from the Idaho Press Club to meet with the Capitol Press and reporters during the session. We submitted the request to you on December 15th, about a month before the session began, and then your staff finally denied it on March 13th, saying that it was too close to the end of the session for you to meet with reporters. Yet under a Public Records Act, I obtained your schedule, and you did meet with other reporters and did do other lengthy on-the-record interviews at that time. And I was just wondering if you could discuss your decision related to the Press Club invitation. This is something that you've done numerous times in a tradition that dates back through numerous administrations.
Right. And there were times that I didn't do it as well. And I didn't do it after we pass a certain time. I think it's usually the 45th day of the legislative session, when issues become more complex, when there's sensitive and tender negotiations going on between my office and the legislature. That, as you well, maybe you won't recall, but there was one year I got in serious trouble with the legislature because I responded to a question that was involved in very serious negotiations, and immediately went up and apologized to the House. Because it was one of those questions that came from members of the press club, and the question was, one body had acted that morning, and what did I think about that? And I responded, and I should have. And so just to avoid those kinds of things, I've said after the 45th day. Now, I've met, you go back and look at the record, I've met many times before the 45th day.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. After the 45th day, you did a series, according to your schedule that your staff provided, you did a series of radio interviews.
Very, very structured.
And a 30-minute.
So you're going to ask this question, I'm not going to answer it, so don't ask it. And we've asked them to submit questions.
Okay, thank you.
Governor, will you address the press club next year as you have most years?
Well, this is before the 45th day.
I'd like to return to the subject of 1067 with the question for the speaker.
Sure.
If that's okay. Speaker, a couple questions, I guess, related to this. One, what was your reaction to that committee's vote? And then that evening, the last night of the session, there was a kind of a parliamentary move to get that bill out of the floor of the House, which didn't succeed. I was wondering what your thinking was at that point in dealing with this issue and what the time frame needed to be.
Well, there's a lot going on the last couple of days, and certainly that evening. As to the parliamentary move, I thought it was interesting, well, it shouldn't be missed by you all that the chairman of that committee stood and made the motion to excuse the committee, and that another chairman sitting next to him seconded the motion, and to keep the committee process whole and in order for the future. This issue is grave in nature, obviously, and we're doing a lot of research at this point to measure the breadth and the scope of it, and I assume that we will act accordingly at some point.
Speaker Becky, as the governor outlined, this is a piece of law that needs to go on the books. That means your only options are to either have a special session or to not make any action on it. If you have a special session, what will be needed to convince the members of your chamber to vote on the matter?
I'm assuming that the members that in that committee voted in good faith. And I'm assuming that when they are able to weigh all of the issues surrounding this, that they will act accordingly.
We were kind of in a rush that last day to get the transportation back through, and obviously we were there for 1 in the morning. This kind of slid by in that process. Do you wish you would have taken an extra day, come back on Monday, where you could have dealt with this and could have cast that vote on the transportation bill?
Well, our taillights are on high beam now, and our headlights were on dim. So I suspect that we could have handled this better, but maybe the handling of that should have started earlier and not at the last minute. I mean, everyone knew we were gone over a week over where we wanted to be, and to put that in the mix after the 2 days of conference committee and all of the emotion and the back and forth that happened there, was unfortunate.
Would you have done anything different?
Would I what?
Would you have done anything different with retrospect?
Well, if I could go back to the first of the session, yes, I would have. But I would also maybe have planned a whole bunch of other things so that we could have been out by the 27th of March.
Mr. Speaker, you had relatively, I don't want to say moderate, but people you wouldn't have necessarily expected to vote to table that bill in committee. Are you confident that you can have a talk with your caucus and get this bill passed if you go to special session?
I'm confident that we will try. I'm confident that these members who feel like they're representing their constituents in good faith, they will sit down and they'll do their due diligence. And I don't want anything I do or say today to bind that process.
And this is a question for both of you, both the governor and Mr. Speaker. Have you been discussing this issue with House Republicans this week to kind of plant the seeds if you do in fact call a special session?
Well, certainly I field phone calls from concerned members. They have questions. And I think that these questions that they're asking are healthy. And I think that they would sync up with some of the concerns that Director Armstrong has mentioned. And these were from both sides of the issue. So I'm confident that there'll be a happy ending here.
Do you support the legislation, Mr. Speaker?
Excuse me?
Do you support the legislation? Will you vote for it if there's a special session?
I think I would.
Mr. Speaker, you mentioned that there might be some...
But I would like to add some of the things that were added in Wyoming and Utah to allay the very same concerns that were expressed there. And so back to the other question, if we'd have had more time, could we have fleshed those out better? We probably could have. Would I like to extend the session over that, given the circumstances? I'm going to stand by my decision that night, but I think that it had we gone, if we'd have had the fire drill 2 weeks earlier than that night, I think we'd have had a better outcome. But I do think that these concerns that were raised there are valid. They've been raised in other states. They've been addressed in other states, and I think that there'll be a good path forward.
Mr. Speaker,
Melissa, let me answer my part of that question. I have never seen, all the years I've been around here, I have never seen, maybe there has been, a successful call on the committee. And the reason for that is because the other members of the legislature that don't serve on that committee rely on that committee to raise the kind of questions, to vet the kind of issues. And so when a chairman asks to be excused, he's respectful of the committee as well. And so, first off, I would discourage you from looking at that vote in excusing the committee from delivering the bill forthwith as any kind of a final vote on the bill. That was out of respect for the committee itself. Now, having said all that, I would also tell you that this week we've engaged a lot of the misgivings, a lot of the misunderstandings, a lot of the issues surrounding that bill that, quite frankly, were not factual. And one of the things that I want to caution everybody about, and especially the members of the legislature, were those who felt that we have never been cut off from federal funds. And that was one of the statements. You know, they always threaten us, but they never do it. I don't know. Well, we passed a lot of uniform laws. In fact, history would reflect that Idaho has adopted at least about 120 and maybe more uniform laws. And I say again, the reason they have to be uniform is so that they apply the same way in every state. So that when Idaho asks somebody in Nebraska, some employer in Nebraska, to send us the money to support the child in Idaho that was left behind, that they're reading the same language that we're reading. So it's the same law. Now, finally, I would say we're going to engage in the next few days getting that kind of information out, and I'm confident that Director Armstrong's letter to the recipients, to the 155,000 households, will encourage a little more communication between not only his agency and the constituents, but also between our offices, the legislative offices. Bill, did you have a question?
I did. I want to get back to transportation a little bit. Speaker Becky, you had the issue of wanting to get a supermajority or caucus signing on any transportation funding solution. I guess my perception is that if that had not been in place and you had just let the Senate transportation proposal, the $127 million proposal, if you just let the House as a whole vote on that, it would have passed. So holding to that 36 requirement essentially costs about $30 million a year. I'm curious.
Well, let's talk about the context that my remarks were blown into. I'm not going to go back into the give and take that happens in our caucus, but it did happen something like this. What if it were just on us to address these long-term infrastructure needs of the state? What if it were just on us in this room? What would we do then? I mean, if we didn't have the governor to rely on, if we didn't have the Senate to rely on, what would we do? Now, to the extent that that morphed into Becky's got to have 36 or we're not going to do anything, then so be it. But my remarks to the caucus were, A, do we have a problem? Everyone agreed that there was a problem. And B, how are we going to fix it? That's of course where all the different ideas started coming up. But to frame my position as absolutely having to have 36 Republican votes coming out of that would be a mischaracterization of the context of that meeting. It was more about trying to get each of these members to engage. They all agreed we had a problem, and now that we agreed on that, what would be the solution? Now that became, that turned into the end of the session we had, because we had numerous bills that were introduced. We had numerous other drafts that were not introduced, from everything from A to Z. And you're very familiar with some of those approaches. But I am proud of the Republican caucus that did step up with 38 votes and support this transportation initiative. I was proud of how the House stood behind the results of the conference committee. I mean, that's a useful tool. We don't use it very often, but I think many of the House members were able to see those guys and engage for 2 days in what was, was trying at times, and they felt that they couldn't have done a better job if they'd have been in the room, and they supported their colleagues in that. And so that was a net good thing there. Again, you had 43 new legislators, nearly all of whom tried to engage on this issue. And so as they made the transition from being activists back home and being legislators here, and having that come together the way it did, I don't know how we can expect much better results than what we got. So that puts the 36 issue hopefully addressed.
Just as a follow-up there, then you're suggesting you didn't leave $30 million on the table.
I'm suggesting that we reacted to the amendments to House Bill 312 in an appropriate way, and it turned out all right.
Betsy?
Mr. Speaker, you mentioned what they did in Utah and Wyoming with the child support enforcement bill. What was added to it other than perhaps placing it in a different section?
Well, I'm going to leave all that research up to you all, but I've been told that they took an approach that kept intact their state sovereignty in a way that, I mean, we in Idaho have no corner on the desire to always be found providing protections to our citizens, due process, if you will. These are not unique to Idaho, and they've been addressed in other states, and I think that we need to explore just exactly what that looks like.
I think we'll have some language. Tammy, do you have that language that you're going to pass out with this other information?
I don't have here, no.
We'll get it.
Could we get it? Okay. We'll get it and make it available to you. In fact, it's on, didn't you say it was on somebody's website already?
We looked it up on their own websites in Wyoming and Utah.
And we were assured by Washington, D.C. that language was acceptable as long as it was in a different type.
Yes.
Governor, I had a question about the future of broadband access for our schools in light of District Judge Owens' voiding of the Idaho Education Network contract. I wanted for you to explain your vision for broadband in schools and perhaps comment on House Concurrent Resolution 26, which circulated at the end of the session and passed, calling on the legislature to commit a committee to take the study of and make recommendations for governance of broadband, but it also talks about how school districts were able to save money when they bought contracts independently on their own. And I was wondering if you could share your vision for broadband in schools and comment on the concurrent resolution, please.
Well, the Idaho Education Network probably comes as close as Idaho ever has to fulfilling the constitutional mandate of free, uniform, thorough, and common. And because it has leveled the mountains, it's closed the distances because of technology. And so I think everybody in the legislature, by their reaction, and they're making some moves to make sure that the IEN continued this year, is prescriptive of what's going to happen in the future. The Idaho Education Network is going to be although it may come out under a different name, we will engage in the interim committee and the legislative interim committee's deliberations on it. And the main thing that I believe we all want is to continue the education opportunities that are a result of the Idaho Education Network.
Do you have a thought on a statewide contract going forward versus the ability of local districts to perhaps...
Well, we know when we were released from the contract, that about 50% of the school districts stayed with the statewide contract because they simply didn't have the personnel or maybe even the expertise in order to go on their own. Was there other efficiencies and economies realized when they got to rebid the contract? I would say yes. I would not expect those to go forward in the future because whether or not some of those new contracts would suggest that, well, before they were being gouged, and so now all of a sudden they're getting it a lot cheaper. We know of some areas where those economies have helped the local school districts. In fact, I think Scott, yours is one of them. But I still think if you take a look at the enabling legislation that was passed, it speaks to more than just education. It speaks to libraries, it speaks to telemedicine, it speaks to the Department of Commerce, and who knows what else we could possibly add to that. Because, as I say again, we have erased the mountains. We have shortened the distances. And in the information age, when you have a tool like that, it's not a tool that you're going to treat lightly. So there will be an IEN in the future, whatever else we may call it, and it will be functioning for education, telemedicine, libraries, and the economy.
Governor Otter, a question for the senators, if possible.
Sure. He doesn't mind.
Oh. I don't know if you're able to answer this, but House Bill 100, the so-called pension spiking bill, was there any reason the Senate didn't take that up after it had passed the House?
I really can't address that. It probably was the chairman and potentially the committee didn't feel they could get it out and didn't have the support there. But specifically, I cannot address it. If you want me to, I can try and find out and get you an answer.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, thank you.
Senator Winder or even Speaker Bedke, regarding the conference committee that was called, it seemed the idea behind having the committee in the first place was to have an open discussion between the two chambers. What we ended up having was one side would float an idea, they would call at ease and discuss things behind closed doors for hours and then come back with another solution or an idea. Could you address concerns from the public that there was not an open discussion and that there were secret meetings to get things done?
Well, it was a very open discussion. There were time periods when there are deals on the table that the committee can't commit to. The committee can come to an agreement for what they think will work, but there was a lot of communication going on with leadership, with the caucus members, with other members of the legislature as to where that deal was, and so that was very fluid. But I can assure the public that that committee did not meet in secret, that every substantive meeting they had was in the public eye, and that the only people that left there were to go to the restroom sometimes, or they were going out to speak with leadership or with other caucus members about the deal. It wasn't to negotiate the deal in secret or anything else. It's just part of how the process works. Because at any time, even in the private sector, when you're negotiating contracts and both parties are at the table, there are times when you want to get away and talk with counsel. There's a time you want to get away and talk with your advisors, so you know what you're coming forward with, and you have the support of your group behind you.
Governor, I'm sorry.
Folks, we have time for one more question after the speaker responds.
Well, I don't know what I could add to Senator Winder's comments, but back to some of the things I already said. You had a lot of House members that were engaged on this issue. They were interested. So as a good chairman, and so we had the chairman of transportation on our conference, as well as the caucus chairman. And so they were fielding questions and well, what about this, or try that? And so what you saw was that process working itself out.
One of the other things that people got up and left the room or had to go get some additional information, I would tell you that not only the tax commission relative to the taxes that were considered in that bill, the transportation department, which ends up with the funding itself, the Department of Financial Management in my office, all those people have to be engaged. Every time a new idea comes up, or an old idea is modified a little bit, what are the consequences of that? And so a lot of those discussions which were off camera or out of the view of the public was, are we on the right track here? Is this the kind of money that this is going to raise? We've changed it from this to this. What kind of difference does that make? And so those are necessary parts, I believe, of any negotiation. Bill?
Thanks, sir. There was a bit of a sideshow this term about an email that President Yaki sent regarding some senators. That person is back, has been reinstated as president. Ag has been supportive of you. I just wanted to see if you had a comment about that whole situation and his return to that position.
Well, I think his statements alone, both public, private, and his apologies to the person that was those comments were directed about, speaks of an effort to reconcile perhaps an emotional moment and to recognize, and it's an educational opportunity here for us all. I don't do email. The reason I don't do email is because I remember when I was in Congress, and when I got ready to leave Congress, I was so embarrassed about some of the stories or jokes that were sent to me that I actually had them shred the hardware. And you know, even if you didn't forward it, if you erased it immediately, you know, if it's on your computer, you own it. And I saw 4 or 5 of my colleagues in Congress go to jail for things that they found on in their email and on their computer. I don't know, maybe that's a better question to ask Hillary Clinton.
Governor, you encourage the legislature to consider your working group's work on Medicaid redesign. They did not. What do you think?
They had hearings. They considered the task force. They considered the consequences on CAT funding, but I'm going to go right back to a promise that I made when the whole Obamacare came up after June of 2011 or 10, whenever the Supreme Court made their decision. And that was that I was not going to engage on either the insurance exchange or Medicaid expansion by myself. That the legislature wanted to be part of it, they're going to be part of it. And so that's why in the state of the state, I encourage them to take up the task force and discuss it. And I would again, and I still would leave that open. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.